Let's make sure. Okay, you guys can see that okay? Gelika sokla ligla kola, gelika sokla ikigame, walasike noke, nuko amputlas, tlu latsutsalas, tlu ananque, Guklin la yalis, kaiken laha namlis, tlu hatwatnis, tlu quagil. So just wanted to take a minute to say welcome everyone, welcome loved ones. I'm really grateful to each and every one of you for taking time out of your day on Halloween, happy Halloween, to take part in this conversation and this dialogue and to listen to some of the things that I have to share from my journey and some of the work that I'm doing. So just want to give thanks to all of our Ninuk Sola, our ancestors, all of our loved ones, our Kwakwaka'wakw speakers, everyone who's doing this work. I realize for where I am, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, all of our ancestors who've paved this way for me to share this, and for all of the nations that's supported this work and my path of healing. So the title of this is called Saltatla, and that we're going to be speaking about trauma-informed yoga and ceremony. And so that translation means, be still and give me your good ear. This one translation I received from one of our hereditary chiefs, Mike Willie. It means to tread softly, and I thought that that was very fitting for this work and what we're embarking on. So with that in mind, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what this talk is going to look like. It's the first time I've structured it in this format, so just ask you to bear with me as I gather my words and put it into from thought into words and action. So we'll start with just a quick grounding practice. I'll describe a bit my relationship, positionality, and some story of how I've come to this work. Giving brief overview of my doctoral research and Indigenous research framework, and describe some trauma theory and frameworks, especially as it relates to Indigenous peoples. Discuss healing as a community strategy, and just share a bit about Indigenous experiences of trauma, healing, and survivance. And just touch on briefly what we're doing with Yoga Outreach, a partnership with the First Nations Women's Yoga Initiative. So we'll have a closing and some time for questions and dialogue. And I'm looking forward to any words, any questions or suggestions and ideas that you might be able to offer me in this discussion. So before we dive in, I just wanted to put a little bit of a disclaimer of a content warning. So since we're talking about trauma, some of these things that come forward are inherently, can bring up painful memories, and it can be triggering. So just wanted to share that and just take a few minutes, a moment here to take some deep breaths and to ground ourselves in this space. I'm really grateful that my Auntie Shelley here brought her big auntie energy to share and invite our ancestors. So just inviting that, calling in your loved ones, whether they are in the spirit world or if they're still living, just bringing their presence to give you strength and guidance. So we're going to take in 7 breaths. One for the 4 sacred directions, 1 to Father Sky, to Creator, and to Mother Earth. So I invite you, if it feels comfortable, to have your eyes closed or open, looking downwards. I'll invite you to keep your hands grounded on your lap or resting in whichever way feels natural and comfortable for yourself. And finding a nice, tall, comfortable spine. If it's possible, to keep your feet touching the earth. That helps that grounded connection. Or if you're sitting on the ground or a couch or a chair, just feeling your legs connected to your seat. And we'll start with a deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. Another breath in. Softening your shoulders. Deep breath in. Imagining each direction. Deep breath in. One for Father Sky. Deep breath in. One for Mother Earth. Deep breath in. And one for the Creator. And gently opening your eyes if they've been closed. Thank you for that. And thank you, Avis, for the introduction. Just want to touch on my relationship and positionality to this work. So I'm Kwakwaka'wakw. I have ancestral ties, and I'm a member of the Numvise First Nation, Womxn from Wakeman Sound, and the peoples of Fort Rupert on my mother's side. And on my father's side, my ancestors came from Belarus and immigrated through New York. So that's where my father was born. So we're Russian Jewish heritage there. And I identify as a cis hetero woman. My spirit name is Star Woman, and that comes from the Chippewa of the Thames Sundance Lodge. And I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a yoga teacher and doctoral student, and currently working with the First Nations Health Authority. And my title is called Traditional Wellness Specialist for Vancouver Island. So I'm very grateful. And living in Alert Bay in Northern Vancouver Island. And how I came to this work, I started off focused on science, Western science, loved learning about the body and rehabilitation. So that brought me to physical therapy. But I always felt that there were some gaps in how that knowledge was shared. It didn't quite resonate with me. And I became a mother during my studies. So in our language, Kwatlayu, or for both, I have two daughters, Kui Kwatlayu. They're my reasons for living, for being. And this really propelled me towards a path of yoga and healing. And so I'm grateful to my children for that, for choosing me. And I started my teacher training in 2013. I've been practicing for a while since then. I wonder if I could advance it. Okay. So this is a picture from the Wabano Center in Ottawa. I was invited to support a young women's leadership retreat. So we had a blend of wellness workshops, yoga and meditation. So this is in their center there. And as you can see at the top part of the star is my my oldest daughter, Maya, when she was a baby. And we're sitting in this beautiful space practicing yoga and meditation. And that was really the start of how I began to teach yoga with Indigenous communities. And I have the date here, August 17th, 2014. And I'm just curious if anyone knows the significance of that date. I kind of doubt anyone would off the top of their head. I had to look it up to make sure, but this is a profound date I believe, in Canadian history and for Indigenous women and girls. This was the day that Tina Fontaine's body was found in the Red River in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Tina Fontaine was a 15-year-old girl who had a very troubled path, a troubled life. She was in the child welfare system. She hails from the Saging First Nation, and she was found on this day. And I remember this specifically, and why I'm sharing it was because this was the morning of our meditation practice. So we came to the Wabano Center even before we left the hotel. We were in the lobby and I could see it. There was TVs all over, and that was the breaking news. That was, the discovery of Tina Fontaine's body. And it shook me to my core. It was disturbing. I could feel it was palpable. It was in the newspapers that were on the tables, and the girls were there. And these are teenage girls from all over, mostly Quebec, different nations there. And they were not much older than Tina Fontaine, between 15 and 17 years of age. And I'm there with my family, with my firstborn daughter, and we're going into this meditation practice. And so at that point, I use a space for us to share a collective prayer and to join our minds together and to honor the life of Tina Fontaine and her family and her community. So I share this quote from Suzanne Methot, who wrote the book called Legacy. And it's healing is not just an individual process, it's also a social one. So this just brings me to share some important words from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. There's calls to action, which you can find, and I'll share some resources. But two of them really speak to me for the work that I'm doing in community with FNHA, also guiding my doctoral research, is these two calls to action. So working within health and wellness and providing better access to care, access to wellness services that are safe and culturally appropriate, as well as supporting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to call on elders, grandmothers, and other knowledge keepers to establish community-based trauma-informed programs for survivors of trauma and violence. So that brings me to share a little bit about my doctoral research. And I'm in the second year, just finishing up my coursework. My program is at the Concordia University in the Individualized Studies program. And the title of my thesis is called Connecting or Reconnecting Through Women's Teachings, Language, and Movement, Culturally Adapted Yoga for Indigenous Women and Girls. And some of the questions that I have to look at with this research are, how can yoga be adapted as a community strategy for cultural and language revitalization with adolescent and knowledge-keeping Kwakwaka'wakw women? What are the main steps and outcomes in transferring and exchanging cultural knowledge and language about women's and youth teachings through community-based yoga? And what influence does ceremony, yoga, and meditation and language learning program have in the lives of First Nations adolescent women and girls? And finally, how can technology-based health innovations be used to deliver trauma-informed yoga for First Nations women and girls? So those might evolve, but those are my baseline questions. And so I'm still early in my research, but this is something that I've been grappling with, designing my research paradigm. And so you can see at the center of the research paradigm is our Kwakwaka'wakw epistemology, which is basically our ways of knowing and being. So that includes all of our culture, our values, our language, our teachings, our worldview, to put it simply. And so the start of this work, it obviously works synergistically and all together. And the first phase is really building and healing relationships. And so that really starts with myself. It starts with preparation of myself as a researcher and doing my work, doing that grounding work, that healing work. It involves healing by learning with community. So co-creating knowledge and creating safe spaces for us to share together and to learn from knowledge keepers and traditional healers. Dismantling oppressive forces, systems, and beliefs. That is a huge one. So that speaks to the decolonizing and ethics component of this work. Gathering knowledge and making meaning, so namyut. So that means we are one. And how we do that and how we understand is through that process. And finally, giving back. So that relational accountability, and how we do that is sharing our wealth. And in this context, the wealth is the knowledge and the practices that are going to be co-created. And that speaks to who we are as potlatch people, sharing our gifts. And so we come to yoga and what this means in our practice. I know that all of you are here for a yoga conference, so you have a good sense of practicing and how that relates to your own bodies. And you might have your own understandings and definitions of that. So I'll just share a little bit about how I've come to understand it. And just drawing on some of the words of Swami Satyananda Saraswati. Yoga stems from the Sanskrit word yuj, to join. It means unity or oneness, and it works on all aspects of the person. So our physical, our vital, our mental, emotional, psychic, and spiritual, all those different layers. Yoga is a balancing and harmonizing of the mind, body, and emotions. And it's the union of our individual consciousness to a universal consciousness. So those are some ways to describe yoga. It's a vast, beautiful, comprehensive spiritual practice, not just physical. And so when we're talking about yoga, we have to look at and start to contextualize a bit the origins and how it's shared in the mainstream. There's vast differences, and there's been a lot that's been skewed when it comes to yoga in the West. And I just want to say, from the research that I've been doing, it's really fascinating, and to reframe yoga and mindfulness as Indigenous wisdom. So obviously yoga is originated in Southeast Asia and comes from ancient Indigenous Indian wisdom. And that's been practiced for over 5,000 years. I believe it's likely a much older system than that. And there's a lot of interconnectedness, and it's all about consciousness. So in all parts of the world, Indigenous people have been engaged in mind-body practices since time immemorial. And I thought this was interesting, that mindfulness, this practice that's really in sort of the more new age circles now, what we hear, and even Western science is adapting it and learning more of the benefits of it. It stems from Buddha, the enlightened one. And Buddha was a member of the Shakya tribe. His clan name was Gautama, and he was given the name Siddhartha. So I thought that was really just awesome to think about, and to reframe that it comes from Indigenous wisdom. And we're not just talking about Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, of North America in this context. I really like this quote from Susanna Barkataki. This comes from her blog. Yoga means liberation from every construct, including that of race, gender, time, space, location, identity, and even history herself. However, in the current cultural context, where there's a billion-dollar industry profiting off of taking yoga out of context, branding and repackaging it for monetary gain, we need to address this, or else we perpetrate a second colonization. So I'm not going to speak too much in depth about appropriation of yoga, but I did want to share a little bit more, and I know that Michelle Cassandra Johnson will be sharing next week for the final week, and I thought it would be fitting to share this quote of hers, that yoga avoids a conversation about whiteness, power, and privilege, because a dominant culture avoids a conversation about racism, oppression, white supremacy, and privilege. So in this context of 2020 and everything that's going on with all our relations, just suitable for us, and just a picture of Marilyn Monroe, I just thought it was kind of interesting, her yoga series back in the day. to look at that and unpack how yoga in the West is presented. So I'll leave it there. There's obviously so much more to be said about that. But I'd like to focus this a little bit more about our Indigenous worldviews and understandings of healing. And so to start there, I'm going to start with trauma theories and frameworks, and just touching on that. I came across this definition by Resmaa Menakem, and he states that trauma is a response to anything that's overwhelming, that happens too much, too fast, too soon, or too long, coupled with a lack of protection or support. It lives in the body, stored as a sensation, pain or tension, or a lack of sensation like numbness. So I just want you to sit with that definition for a minute, and we'll start to unpack it a little bit and what that means. And how do we come to understand that, and how do we begin to address trauma? And so from what I understand from the work that I've been doing on my healing journey and research, we have to look at trauma and awareness. So from that definition, we know that trauma and traumatic memory is held somatically, meaning it lives within our body. Issues in the tissues I've heard other people describe. And recently I've had the privilege to work with many different elders, and one of the Nuu-chah-nulth elders from Hausa, Dave Frank, spoke about how intelligent our brain is by design, and how our brain can block out that trauma and that traumatic memory, but that it still lives in our body. And so working through our different healing practices to release that trauma from our body is what is part of the work. And so what that involves is having a deeper connection to what some trauma researchers like David Emerson talks about, interoception. So that awareness of what's going on within the boundaries of our own skin. So that intra-organismic awareness. Also knowing our connectedness to proprioception, or the awareness of our body in relation to external objects, and exteroception, the awareness of stimuli from outside. So being mindful and drawing your awareness to the sights, sounds, and smells. There's obviously many different types of trauma. This isn't comprehensive, but if we look at it on sort of a continuum of different approaches, so there's acute, what things can happen in sort of single acts of violence and terror. There's chronic, which could be prolonged or community violence or long-term illness. Complex, which is often described when we have things like adverse childhood experiences in children in our early lifespan. So that could be neglect or chronic violence or exposure at an early age, and historical and racial trauma. And as we're seeing now, there's other types of trauma like pandemic trauma. Just wanted to focus a little bit on racialized trauma. And again, this book is really well written by Resmaa Menakem, who I opened that definition with about trauma. And historical and racial trauma is a collective and cumulative trauma experienced by a group across generations that are still suffering the effects and current experiences of race-based trauma. So it's systematic oppression, racism, discrimination, and harassment across generations. And so this impacts Indigenous peoples, as well as Black people, any people of color, something called racialized trauma, in case any of you weren't aware of that. It's a great book. So Indigenous peoples' experience of trauma. I just wanted to make a note here that although I'm sharing a historical image of a beautiful woman here, a Kwakwaka'wakw woman, this isn't to make it seem that this traumatic experience is past tense, because as we're going to speak about it, we look at time in a different context as that impacts past, present, and future. And colonization is one imposition, one thing, a huge phenomenon that's impacted Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada or in the US, but all around the world, wherever there's been settler colonialism or extractive colonialism. And it's ongoing, and how we experience that today through government policy, through corporations, it's still ongoing. So not to speak of this in a past tense, but it's a complex phenomenon. And we'll get into it, but trauma is not inseparable from healing and wellness. And so just being mindful that where I'm sitting with my auntie here in Alert Bay, there was a residential school standing here called St. Michael's, and there was many that impacted nations, and in the US they were known as boarding schools. But I just wanted to leave this here with us to hold on to and just take a moment to reflect on how profound just one of these experiences from the colonial agenda has been. So if we were to hold a moment of silence for each child who died in residential school, we'd be silent for over 13 years. Just take a deep breath into that. And that's one legacy. That is just one legacy of a huge mess that has really harmed ourselves as individuals, our family structures, our communities, and our nations. There's many more. I'm not going to go into too much depth around colonial history, but I would like to share that one significant thing that on the colonial agenda was to interrupt and to make our ceremonies and our spiritual systems forbidden. So we were forbidden to practice our ceremonies for nearly 100 years. I think it was between 80. But when the ban was lifted, it was called the potlatch ban in Canada. It still took at least 20 years for people to feel comfortable to start sharing that. So if you think about how many generations in that time frame were severely impacted, and those practices are how we deal with grief, how we deal with loss, how we celebrate people, how we uplift people in our community, our rites of passage, our coming of age, our ceremonies of marriage and adoption, all of that were restricted. All of our ways of governance and our political systems were interrupted because there's not a separation. We don't compartmentalize our spirituality from our practices. That is for Kwakwaka'wakw, and it goes the same across nations. It's a fundamental aspect of who we are as Bakwan people or Onkwe original people of this earth. We're deeply connected to the land. And that was also targeted, forcing us to live on small pieces of land called reservations or reserves. These were very inhospitable, and it impacts all of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So I'll leave it at that. There's obviously a lot more to say about how that's impacted, but I'd like to just move forward into healing as a community strategy. And this is an image that was captured by Shelley's son, her oldest son, Trevor Isaac, of the demolition of the St. Michael's residential school. And this image always struck me as being so powerful. And there was such a cathartic release during this demolition for our community. Many hundreds of people came together to witness the demolition and to take part in it by throwing bricks and stones at the building to release anger and frustration and to make space for healing from this legacy of the residential school that stood here for, I don't know how long, over 70 years, longer probably. Yeah, way longer, yeah. So this is another book written by Eduardo Duran. He works with American Indians and other Native peoples as a clinical counselor, a psychologist, and he didn't coin all of this, but some of the context of what he shares in his work is really interesting in capturing that terms he's used, like the soul wound and ancestral hurt. And this speaks to other concepts that Marie Brave Yellowhorse has shared in her research with the Lakota people around historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. And intergenerational trauma has been a new sort of theory or framework of how that transmission of trauma occurs through the generations. And that research started with Jewish people, with Holocaust survivors. And they were looking at doing research to look at how their descendants, Holocaust survivors' descendants, were impacted, although they didn't attend any concentration camps. They were still profoundly impacted in many ways through the generations. They also looked at Japanese prisoners of war to understand that transmission of intergenerational trauma. And it's becoming more understood in Indigenous scholarly circles and communities who are looking at trauma and understanding it. So I love this quote, and I think, again, it's really important not to lose sight of this, is that if we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and DNA. So there was I don't know if you guys could hear that. There's sound like a dying dog somewhere outside here. So this is one of the fundamental things, is that when we're talking about trauma theories and frameworks, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, integrating a cultural and spiritual framework are unique considerations for understanding Indigenous communities' healing. So that intergenerational trauma and blood memory, I spoke to this briefly around that trauma theory, and this comes to relating to the soul wound of what Eduardo Duran was speaking about, and how that trauma memory is transmitted across generations. That's something that researchers are understanding a bit more on a neurophysiological level, how it's transmitted through biological processes, also through social processes, and how it's upheld to this day through our cultural ways of understanding and sort of the greater context of society. So understanding trauma experienced by Indigenous people must include historical, social, and political factors, and it cannot be limited to biological, physiological, or genetic processes alone. And I love this image, is showing that connection from conception to elderhood and to spirit, how we're all connected in that way. So this is the next thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit more, is healing and contemplative practices from an Indigenous lens. And really this comes from my own journey. So I'm not speaking for anyone else other than myself and my experiences there. There are many infinite stories and so much wisdom, and also want to recognize that it's profoundly personal for people to share their own stories of healing, and that often it's kept to be sacred and personal. And this quote by Richard Bagamies, just love this quote so much. It speaks to me, and it's, "We are never separate from creation or creator. Ceremony is an emotional connection to that truth." So that comes from a book that Richard Bagamies has written. And I believe it really relates to also the definition or sort of the concept of yoga. Since it's that connection to the greater consciousness, ceremony is that process. It's our yoga of connecting to creator and to creation. And how we do that is through predominantly land-based spirituality. So when we talk about the soul wound and healing the soul wound, how we do that is looking at our resilience and ceremony and how that's persevered through the times, through a lot of the colonial agenda, where there's been interruptions. A lot of people took that underground, and that knowledge is still lived on, and we still practice our ceremonies to this day, and innovating ceremonies and coming up with new practices. And it speaks to our land-based spirituality. Reclaiming culture, language, and traditions, reconnecting with land-based practices and our traditional territories, connecting to our embodied practices such as drumming, chanting, and singing, and of course, humor, art, and creative practices. So what does healing look like? I find this is a question, or something that one of my elders had shared with me, is that we don't know what healing looks like, other than when we experience it in our own bodies, in our own beings. We can't, accurately measure what another person outside of ourselves, what that looks like. And obviously, maybe in your own experiences, you can attest to that cyclical process, that sometimes roller coaster feeling of healing. It's a journey. And so in my experience, what it's looked like for me is prayer, embodiment, embodied practices, mindfulness and contemplation. Neuro-decolonization, which I'll share about in a moment, is a concept brought forward by a researcher named Dr. Michael Yellowbird. Language learning, fasting, purifying, and dancing. And so this is an image of the tree of life in a Sundance arbor. And I've danced 3 years officially with our Chippewa of the Thames Sundance. And this year we were given ours as a 4th year, with COVID pandemic having to cancel it. But I still feel like there's work to be done to wrap up that 4-year commitment at that lodge. And, again, just speaking, this is a way of life. It's not just a notch on one's belt. It's a commitment and really a way of being and living. This is just an image sharing our Kwakwaka'wakw word for prayer or giving thanks, Hawakila. And our ocean is is our healing source. It's a way for us to cleanse ourselves spiritually and physically, emotionally, and mentally. So in the experiences that I've had to go out into the ocean, to go to the water and to cleanse, has provided tremendous healing. Time to cry, time to scream, time to reflect, and just connect inwards. I call my spirit in. It's a beautiful practice and comes from, a lot of people on the West Coast being saltwater people. And this is an image recently. I had the amazing experience to attend over on the West Coast at the Ushtakyu membership process. So Ushtakyu is the Nuu-chah-nulth word for traditional healer or helper, or sometimes shaman. And they have a beautiful society that they are reviving. And this is a spruce tree. And I started my 1st year of fasting sitting under this beautiful spruce tree. And in our worldview, Indigenous worldview, everything has spirit, everything has a connection to creator. And that spruce medicine is very powerful for helping to heal that intergenerational trauma and pain. And in our concept, it's a grandmother. And we look at the trees as being ancient beings who carry the wisdom and connection. So for me to sit under this was really transformative. And I had a lot of time to sit and pray and contemplate and connect, and embodiment, in the sense that you're sitting and connecting with this tree and embodying that medicine from that tree. Also had the chance to look at the ocean and embody that and connect with the waves, which was beautiful. And this is a beautiful picture of Avis O'Brien dancing in our big house, and just sharing that connection to our big house, where we practice our culture and spirituality, connecting to the elements, connecting to our songs. This is a healing space for us. And I just love this image. They're dancing the salmon dance. And so connecting, our songs and practices are interconnected to our environment, and salmon being one of our main sources of sustenance. We're deeply spiritually connected to the salmon. And I just wanted to share that. Other practices of healing could look like blanket making, or other cultural practices like cedar bark weaving or beading, other things that we do with connecting. There's a lot of meditation that goes into this, a lot of concentration and intention of sewing on individual buttons or beads, or making regalia. There is a very powerful process that's similar to experiences I've had of practicing yoga, if not more deeply connected, because we connect to our identities, our namimas, our crests, and who we are. We begin to understand that on a much deeper level. So I'm often reminded of this when we're doing healing work. We're healing ourselves, and that is community work. So yeah, that resonates with you as well. This is a quote from Judith Herman, and I find that coming to this helps me to reflect on how to work through trauma. And so she discusses that the core experiences of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. Recovery, therefore, is based upon empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. So that makes sense to me in this work because of the creation of new connections in particular. It's not just relational to ourselves and to families, to our ancestors and to communities, but it's also connecting to the living world and the supernatural realms. I apologize for the scrolling here. It's just a little bit of a lag. Hopefully it's okay on your end. So just want to share a little bit more, focusing in on yoga and Indigenous communities, and more broadly looking at yoga, mindfulness, and meditation, and how wellness is presented. This is one of my favorite paintings by Roy Henry Vickers. I think it's called Balance. And so this quote by David Emerson: like yoga, trauma also has an ancient tradition. It has been written about and speculated upon within cultures all around the globe for millennia. From ancient epic poems, philosophical speculation, to treatment interventions. So just contextualizing that and just sharing a few images. These are different yoga teachers who are based in the US. So on the left here is Christine Means, Haley Lofter's Hosho yoga practice in Arizona, and Akastia Red Elk, who is a jingle dress dancer, a powwow dancer, and she integrates traditional dancing into her yoga. So very cool, awesome people doing great work, bringing their culture into their yoga practice. And I love this quote. It came from the journal Race and Yoga. And Haley Lofter says that my yoga pictures depict my identity as an Indigenous woman. Yoga is an expression of who I am, connected to the elements and the earth, in a place that I come from, in my case, shipwreck, or being part of the land. So you can see that's shipwreck in Arizona. And so just this is not exhaustive by any means, but just a few different accounts of people to follow who are putting forward movements of wellness and just a reminder to uplift and celebrate Indigenous brilliance and innovation and success as much as we're talking about Indigenous trauma and suffering. I always think that we can't just get stuck in on the heaviness, and we really have to focus our energies and empower and uplift those who are doing the good work, because healthy living and wellness, it's contagious. We can learn from each other. So a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I included myself here in Cedar and Gold. And also I started this account called Indigenous Yoga Movement. I'll have to admit I've been a little bit delayed and not committing as much time as I'd like, but that's really to promote and uplift all of the wonderful work people across Indian country and around the world, what they're doing with their endeavors to promote yoga from an Indigenous worldview. And so some other people there to take a look at the good work that they're doing. So speak to that a little bit more here, and what that means for survivance of Indigenous peoples and revival of ancestral ways and innovation. So just want to say that survivance is a word that blends together the concepts of survival and resilience or resistance. So that's that connection there of Indigenous people, how we've thrived. And this is a couple who's founded Well for Culture. Sorry, I'll just scroll back up. Chelsea Luger and Anthony Thosh Collins, doing some great work as a husband and wife couple promoting wellness for Indigenous communities. And this initiative is just incredible. I was so deeply inspired when I came across this. Uti Kulinjaku from Aboriginal Australian women. And so that is their word that translates to think and understand clearly. And it comes from the NPY Women's Council in Australia on the southern and central coast. And they're working with knowledge keepers and traditional healers to create a mindfulness app that integrates their language and their traditional teachings of meditation and contemplative practices by making it accessible using technology. So this is something that I find is incredible work, and is a question that I have in my doctoral research of how can we better use technology to support our healing and revitalization of our traditional contemplative practices. And so I mentioned this before. This is something that I'm unpacking a little bit more on what it means, neurodecolonization. And so again, that's been coined by a researcher who comes from a social work background, but really looks at cognitive and neuroscience to describe this from an Indigenous lens, Dr. Michael Yellowbird. And neurodecolonization involves understanding how the mind and the brain function and are shaped by the stresses of colonialism. It's the deliberate and systemic use of particular exercises and activities that can be used to transform one's mind and brain structures and functions to attain the highest levels of well-being. And the goal is to delete old, ineffective brain networks and support destructive thoughts, feelings, memories, and behaviors to encourage the growth of new beneficial brain networks to allow us to engage in optimistic thinking. And really the key is that decolonization and impacting that on the deepest levels in our mind and our consciousness. So there's a really great book that he's written that I just received called For Indigenous Minds Only, a decolonization handbook. And that comes from chapter 4, neurodecolonization. So just speaking on there again, decolonizing and embodied practices. So decolonizing is a goal and a process. Much like healing, it's a lifelong journey, and we can continue to do this and strive for this on a daily basis. And I love this quote by Tria Blue-Wakpa from the Race and Yoga Journal. And she stated in this article that the endurance and innovation of Indigenous embodied practices is critical to decolonization. So So incorporating our native or indigenous epistemologies, our values, stories, and language is something tremendously important. And just another quote here is that when we focus our energies internally, we discover our strength to heal ourselves. Our ancestors lived in a way of balance. In the Navajo culture, this is Hojo. Hojo is a Navajo belief shared by other indigenous beliefs of a natural balance in the universe of all things. It is each person's right and responsibility to create balance in life so that we can contribute to our communities and build stronger families. When we learn how to cope with the stresses of life, this helps us to make healthy choices for ourselves. And that comes from Christine Means of Arikara, Yankton, Dakota, and Navajo descent, doing some yoga with elders here. And as it relates to trauma-informed yoga, just coming back to a quote from Susanna Barkataki, and what she states is that yoga has always been focused on seeking to heal trauma and to balance the fluctuations of the mind to alleviate inner and outer anguish. And so from ancient times, for thousands of years, yogis used this practice to free themselves from suffering and to pass those teachings on for thousands of years through oral history, through practices. Obviously, it's been highly documented as well. But the main aim is seeking liberation. And I love what she says is to ignore and erase the roots of trauma informed is a colonialist and racist agenda. So when we're thinking about trauma-informed practice, it's inherent in yoga. This is just to touch on briefly some of the work that I've been involved with my doctoral work is the integration of trauma-informed yoga and how that works when we're bridging that and embedding it in our community initiatives and our programming with Indigenous people. I've had the fortune of working with many different communities from different backgrounds, whether they're students, whether they're homeless people in shelters or on the street, men in incarcerated men, youth in residential facilities. I've worked with a lot of different people in some very difficult living situations. And my work is really focused on women and girls. So this is the title of a forthcoming publication that I'm hoping, fingers crossed, gets all approved to go into the International Journal of Indigenous Health. And it's relating to a series, a reflective piece for a promising practice, working with girls, Indigenous adolescent girls under youth protection, and how we connected yoga into a series that led into beadwork and integrating cultural practices. So just a few things of what trauma-informed yoga is not. And so through trauma-informed yoga, we're not processing the emotional content of trauma. We're not understanding the traumatic experiences. And in a yoga class, we're not aiming to treat trauma or any conditions. It's really building that connection to ourselves and focusing on self-regulation and self-awareness. I think coming with that lens, that humility approach. And so some of the principles, I'm just to make sure I'm doing okay for time here. Principles of trauma-informed yoga that I've integrated is bringing in invitational language and being adaptable, helping to establish clear boundaries and consent, using a strength-based approach and one that builds strength, one that fosters decision-making, creating trust and safety, supporting relationship buildings to self and others, and fostering self-love and acceptance, and also looking at nervous system education and being pro-parasympathetic whenever possible. So just a few more slides here and we'll do a closing practice. Maybe we'll take a quick break too for integrating trauma-informed yoga with cultural practices. maybe just take a quick pulse. Do you guys want to take a couple minutes to just have a bio break and stretch a little bit? Don't want to continue rambling on, or just feel free to take care of yourself. Maybe let me know if you'd like to take a few minutes here.
Stand up, sit down a few times.
Yeah. Shelley says you got to stand up and sit down a few times and do some squats.
Put my butt so you know.
Mm-hmm.
You're planning to practice, Jessica. It's okay. Go ahead, and just unless you feel like you need a little break.
I just wanted to make sure I'm not. I feel like I'm talking a lot, so let me just take a quick look at the remaining slides. Okay, I'm getting pretty close to the end, so if it's okay with you guys, we'll carry on and close with a practice. So. And have a bit of a dialogue. So from my experience integrating trauma-informed yoga with cultural practices, it can be integrated, and it's a really beautiful approach to finding some healing strategies and bringing wellness to a space, to community. Trauma-informed yoga can be complementary to talk therapy or psychotherapy, and it can be an adjunct to other programs that are in community. It can be complementary to traditional practices and ceremonies. Earlier in October, I had the absolute honor to do a chair yoga practice with a bunch of traditional knowledge keepers and medicine people. And that was really fun to share that gift of movement with one another, and turned into a lot of laughter because we talked about the root chakra and mula bandha and different things. So there's a lot of ways that the concepts are already embedded and understood in our medicine ways and practices. And so trauma-informed yoga, it's one framework, and it's an approach to integrate to a vast realm of Indigenous healing practices and other forms of yoga. So from what I have been learning, it's not the be and end all, but it is one way that introduces a safety framework to look at and to see how does that work when we bring it to different people in our community, such as youth and women. So some of the next steps and some further contributions is continuing some community yoga classes with the COVID-19 considerations. That's been harder to do, but not impossible. And we'll be working on delivering some in community classes in the North Island. I have excited to speak briefly about a partnership that we have, that I have with Yoga Outreach. And one thing we are co-creating is a 80-hour trauma-informed and culturally responsive curriculum called the First Nations Women's Yoga Project. And we are making some great headway with the curriculum development and just establishing our ethical framework and how we're moving forward before we dive into interviews with community consultants and working with different elder women and matriarchs in our community, and younger women who are community leaders and doing some powerful work in their practices. So we're excited, and that will be launching our first cohort in February, and we'll have some great baseline information to gather from the cohort and learn with them of how to design this and how it can work, and especially leaning on those technological health innovations, like how do we deliver this virtually and adapt to this current pandemic time. And just some ongoing work with the First Nations Health Authority, my role as traditional wellness specialist. So there's a lot of work ahead with making connections with traditional wellness practitioners, traditional healers, knowledge keepers, language speakers, and all kinds of people who carry the teachings, and how we're going to be building those networks to strengthen their work and encourage mentorship and passing those teachings on so that we can continue nurturing and practicing our Indigenous contemplative mindfulness and healing systems. So I thought I would close with this closing practice and a song. And yeah, I just invite you to, maybe we'll just take a minute here. I know I need to stand up and just sort of wiggle out my body and stretch a little bit. Move your body and just get comfortable before we find a little bit of breath work and stillness. Maybe grab a sip of water. If you've got any medicines that you work with or anything in your medicine bundle, I'll invite you to share. We'll share in sort of a virtual smudge and connecting to close up this practice. And just wanted to share a few words from this practice that it was inspired by Richard Wagamese' work in One Drum. And yeah, we'll just give it one more minute for people to get set up. And we'll leave some time for any dialogue, any questions after this. So for those of you, just wanted to share briefly too that trying in the spirit of this virtual gathering, making attempts to create a sacred space and that sacred container that my auntie talked about in her prayer, and taking care of ourselves and how do we offer that outwards. So I just encourage you that even though we are connecting in this way virtually and we're not together, just connecting to bring ourselves together and share that interconnectedness. And it's been really heavy with this pandemic of not being able to gather. I just want to recognize that for all of you, any of you who may be having some difficulties at home or in your own mind, in your own body, your own health. And just use this practice to connect and to find that some stillness, find that connectedness to Creator, or however you want to connect with your spiritual practice, that higher consciousness. And what we're going to do here is called the Sacred Breath Ceremony. And it's a very simple ceremony that can be practiced at any time of the day. It's encouraged to practice this first thing in the morning. So before we get up and crawl out of bed, taking this time to connect with our sacred breath and greeting the day. So before we say our prayers or greetings or affirmations, setting intentions, whatever that may be, we can start with a sacred breath ceremony. And we can do this before we go to sleep, or if we're stuck in traffic, or if we're frustrated, or even doing the dishes, whatever it might be. Just invite you to cultivate this in your own being, in your own body, and your spiritual experience. So I invite you to take a deep breath. And it's a simple ceremony. We're going to be taking 10 breaths. And I encourage you to breathe deeply in through your nose and out through your nose. And if that creates any problems, just breathing out through your mouth is fine. We're going to be taking 10 breaths just to connect ourselves and just being mindful of that breath. And that breath comes from Creator. And each time that we breathe in, I invite you to say in your mind, I am one with creation. So we'll take the next few minutes to breathe at our own pace here. Bringing in that connection of being one with creation. Maybe you notice some sounds in your home or outside of your home. Hearing birds, any other animals. Listening for the wind. And listening to the sound of your own sacred breath. Wherever you are, wrapping up with your final breaths. I'm going to close with a song that was shared at our traditional fasting camp by Patrick Ullman. It's the Women's Warrior Song. And this comes from their people, the Statlium people. And it's from their family. And he shared with us that we can share this and sing this in our spiritual practice as women. And it's cultivating that strength that we have. And so I'll invite you just to receive. If you'd like to sing on your end, if you know it, feel free to do so. And thank you again to Patrick Ullman for sharing that song with us at our fast over in Mears Island. Just thinking about all of our communities who are seeking healing, seeking prayers, and all of our women and children, loved ones. So thank you very much for your time and for listening. Just wanted to close with that song and invite you to share any questions, whether you want to type them in the chat box or stop sharing here. Type them in the chat box or unmute yourself and share any comments.